Welcome to the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Rosensweet, mom of 3 young people, peaceful parenting coach, and your cheerleader and guide on all things parenting. Each week, we'll cover the tools, strategies, and support you need to end the yelling and power struggles and encourage your kids to listen and cooperate so that you can enjoy your family time. I'm happy to say we have a great relationship with our 3 kids. The teen years have been easy and joyful, not because we're special unicorns, but because my kids were raised with peaceful parenting. I've also helped so many parents just like you stop struggling and enjoy their kids again. I'm excited to be here with you today and bring you the insight and information you need to make your parenting journey a little more peaceful. Let's dive into this week's conversation. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. Today's episode is a guest expert interview with Dr. Alok Kanojia, also known as Dr. K of The Healthy Gamer. This is something that a lot of you have been asking about. How do we get our kids off video games or off screens? Why do they like them so much? What do we do when they don't want to turn them off? And Dr. K answers all of that and more and helps us understand what's going on in the brain, why it's so hard to get kids to do things other than screens or games, and some really great concrete suggestions for us as parents. Towards the end of our interview, he also shares some preventive strategies for how we can play video games or let our kids play video games in a way that is healthy, where they won't go down the road towards video game addiction. If you have a friend that you think would like to hear this episode, please share it with them. Maybe you have a friend who's struggling with their kids and getting them off screens or off the video games, or have a friend who has young kids who's wondering how we can do this. You know, video games are so much a part of our culture today. You can't really avoid them. So how can we introduce games in a healthy way? Please screenshot this or email it to a friend, screenshot it and share it on your social media. The more people we can reach, the more people we can introduce to peaceful parenting, the better our world will be, and the happier our kids will be, and the happier our families will be. So let's meet Dr. K and hear what he has to say about healthy gaming. Hey, Dr. K, welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here, Sarah.
I know a lot of parents are really, really looking forward to this because I get so many questions about gaming and screen time from parents. And I think that, we can't go back in time. A lot of parents sort of wish we could put that genie back in the bottle. So I think everyone's going to be really excited to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I think, I originally started out working with gamers, but as I've become a parent myself, I find myself gravitating more and more towards supporting parents.
Great. Well, I love it. And I know you have Healthy Gamer is all about supporting parents, right? That part of well, let's back up. Tell us about who you are and what you do and about Healthy Gamer.
Sure. So I grew up playing a lot of video games. My parents loved me very much, but I don't think they understood what they were dealing with. So struggled a lot with video game addiction, basically failed out of college. My dad suggested that I go to India to find myself. So I went to an ashram, which is kind of like a monastery, and then fell in love with it. So I was there for about 3 months, decided to become a monk, worked on that for about 7 years, and then left when I met my wife, went to med school, became a psychiatrist. And then while I was doing my psychiatry training, started talking to my mentors about gaming addiction, and then sort of realized that no one really knows what's going on. I mean, they're just amazing people, very, very adept. I trained at Harvard Medical School, so they're, really excellent in a lot of ways. But I sort of realized that if you sort of look at the people who are leading the field of psychiatry, they're in their 50s, 60s, 70s, which is awesome, but they don't have a whole lot of personal experience with video games. So I started talking to gamers about why do you play games? What makes it hard? I had recovered from my own gaming addiction at that point. I still play games, but in a healthy way. And then focused on addiction psychiatry for a few years and basically just helped hundreds of gamers. And then eventually started streaming on Twitch, which is a gaming streaming platform, and started streaming about video game addiction on a gaming platform.
Oh, cool.
Awesome. So everyone loved it, surprisingly. Even Twitch loved it. And so we sort of focused on helping people become healthy gamers. And since then, we've grown. So we make all kinds of mental health content for the digital generation.
I love that. It's so needed. So where do you draw the line between someone who where do you see a video game addiction versus just somebody who likes to play video games? Because I do hear that thrown around a lot, like parents saying, oh, my kid's addicted to video games.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think there's sort of 2 angles to this. The first is the clinical angle, Where if we sort of think about even something like alcohol, how do you know what is a safe amount of alcohol use versus someone who's an alcoholic? So anytime we're looking at the clinical definition of an addiction, it's something that impairs function. So if the gaming interferes with your ability to perform well academically, professionally, interferes with your social relationships like family or friends, or keeps you from making friends, interferes with your physical health or mental health, then we sort of really start thinking about addiction. I think what a lot of parents see, though, is that they're noticing that their kids are developing unhealthy relationships with technology, where even if the kid isn't failing out of school, you know your kid could be getting better, doing better. And you also like everything seems really, really hard, right? So sure, your kid is getting Bs, but they're getting Bs because parents are working really hard to get them off the screen and kind of force them into studying and stuff like that. So I think we're definitely seeing two things. One is a clinical threshold of, okay, this game is really interfering with someone's life. And the second one is parents are fighting an uphill battle around games. And if the kid is left to themselves, then they would absolutely have problems. So I think we're seeing both of those.
Okay. So what is healthy gaming?
Yeah, so I think if you look at video games are a form of recreation. They're a form of connection. I've worked with hundreds, if not thousands, of gamers. And I would say for each gamer I've talked to who is suicidal because they have nothing going on in their life and all they do is playing video games, I've also talked with one gamer who what kept them from killing themselves was actually gaming. Mm-hmm. And so games are a way that we form connections with people. They're a way that we form community. And so what we really think about in terms of healthy gaming is how can you use the game without it interfering with the other parts of your life? So how can you use it recreationally? How can you use it to have fun? How can you use it to form healthy connections, but that don't get in the way of you forming real life connections?
So what I'm hearing is a lot about balance.
100%.
Yeah.
So what I think is the root of unhealthy gaming is when we start to use games to fulfill needs that we should be fulfilling in other parts of our life.
I heard you in I think one of your YouTube videos talking about dopamine and games. Can you just give us a little bit of rundown and help us understand why games are so, I don't want to say appealing, because I think they can be appealing without being addicting, but like help us understand about what happens in the brain when kids are playing games.
And so what happens in the brain, first of all, goes so far beyond dopamine. So if we look at any addictive substance or any addiction, addictions do two things. They give us pleasure and they take away pain. So if you look at dopamine release, there's something really interesting in the brain where dopamine is released anytime we face a challenge and we overcome that challenge. So why is the brain this way? It's because we've kind of evolved because that helps us survive, right? So if we kind of think about, like, let's say I'm a hunter and I try to hunt something that's very large and dangerous because it provides a lot of food for my tribe. So if you sort of think about that risk taking and success, that releases dopamine. So things that we consider fun or enjoyable will usually release dopamine. Now, the tricky thing about games is that they've sort of figured out, game developers have figured out that if you make a game too easy, people will get bored of it and will leave. If you make a game too hard, it'll be too hard, it's not worth the effort, and they'll quit playing. So over time, what's happened in the gaming industry, they've sort of figured out how to perfectly titrate the difficulty of a game so that it maximally increases dopamine release. Now, dopamine is not only the neurotransmitter that governs pleasure, it also governs behavioral reinforcement and anticipation. So it does all three of those things. So anytime you get dopamine, it reinforces the behavior, i.e. encourages your brain to do it again, and even starts to induce cravings. So that's kind of what games do with dopamine. I think the other big thing that people really miss out on is that games also suppress our negative emotional circuitry. So if you look at other addictive substances, they numb us out, right? So if I'm having trouble, and this is something that I sort of experienced on a day-to-day basis, I was a freshman in college and I was like in Spanish class. And so I missed a couple days of Spanish class because I was gaming. And then as I started to feel further behind, that was like too much to handle emotionally. I'm falling behind. I missed so many days that it's impossible for me to get an A. And those emotions were so powerful that I had to numb them out, which I did through gaming. And the more that I gamed, the more that I fell behind in Spanish class, and then I couldn't tackle that emotion. So I fell into gaming more and more and more. So I think especially if you look at like gaming and pornography addiction, a lot of it is really about that emotional numbness.
Right. And so if we think about, like I told you before we came on the call, that a lot of my community has kids who are maybe, 5 through 12, and maybe some of the littler ones aren't doing games yet, but they're watching TV or watching shows. In terms of the two components that you just talked about, like the dopamine, and correct me if I've gotten this wrong, like the dopamine being released because of the reward of, the challenge and then the reward. And then the second part about the numbness, would you say that like TV and screen time would not fill the first thing that you were talking about, would fill the second thing?
So it's a great analysis, Sarah. It turns out that watching TV also releases dopamine.
Okay. I
So
just
so
wondered
the,
if it wasn't the same challenge as a game might be.
yeah, so I think the interesting thing is if you look at like TV's been around for decades, right? But TV addiction is not as big of a problem
Yeah.
as gaming addiction.
Yeah.
And why
Yeah.
is that? It's because gaming actually releases more dopamine
Mhm.
than watching TV. Now, when you're talking about young kids and screen time, there are a couple of different things going on there. The first is that sometimes parents will use screens to regulate emotions and induce compliance. So if I have a kid who doesn't want to finish their food, I can slap an iPad up there and have them watch while they kind of eat their veggies, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
normally if a kid doesn't want to eat their veggies, that's an unenjoyable experience, which I can kind of numb them out and kind of reduce that defiance through something like a screen. So
Which
we
we're not
absolutely
which we're not advocating, by the way.
no, it's a terrible idea.
Yes.
And so I think that sometimes, if you want your kid to behave or calm down or you need to get some work done, right? Parents will use screen time as a tool to induce a certain kind of behavior. The problem with that is that if you sort of think about it, what that's doing is it's not allowing the child to form those connections in their brain to regulate their own emotions. They're outsourcing their emotional regulation to the screen. And so over time, what you'll find is that the higher the amount of screen time that a child gets, the more likely they are to be emotionally dysregulated without the screen. They
Mhm.
start throwing temper tantrums, and then the only thing that calms them down is the screen.
Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Dr. Stuart Shanker. He was on my podcast a couple months ago, and he talked about the difference between kids who are doing screens appearing calm versus actually being calm. And I think that's sort of what you're talking about also. Like you can have the temporary appearance of regulation when they're occupied in front of a screen, but it actually doesn't help them achieve any regulation.
Absolutely, quite the opposite, right? So what's happening is that you're right that they appear calm because the screen is literally numbing out their negative emotions and their emotional regulation. We also see that we also see an atrophy of attentional skills when kids use a lot of screen time. And especially with some of these screen times like YouTube compilations and stuff like that, I think have a greater negative impact than even watching like an episode of a cartoon.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is that everything is so engaging on the screen that you don't have to force yourself to focus on the screen, right? Because it's just so naturally engaging. And
Yeah.
if it's naturally engaging, then you're not training your brain to focus on something that you need to focus on.
My favorite thing in the world is reading, but I find that I need to have my phone in another room if I'm reading, because that the pull to like, oh, I wonder if anyone emailed me or if I have any new Facebook notifications is so strong that even when I'm doing something that I want to do, that I love, I can still feel the pull of the screen.
100%. So there's some fascinating studies. One study showed that even having your phone in the same room, just like you said, actually increases cortisol. Just having
Mm-hmm.
it in the same room, whether it's on
Interesting.
silent or not silent, increases cortisol. The other thing that you touched on, which is really fascinating, is that when our phone is in the same room, there is a certain amount of cognitive load to resist the addictive impulse of checking your phone.
Mm-hmm.
So the phone has so many like notifications and enjoyable things and gives you so much dopamine and engagement that you have to kind of constantly resist that impulse, which literally does reduce people's willpower and has a cognitive load of its own.
Wow, that's so interesting. Okay, I want to shift a little bit here because I think we've got a bit of more of an understanding on why it's so hard to just not, to resist the screens. And I want to present you with just a little mini case study, which is actually a client of mine that we've been working on. Their child is 10, and they've got some decent, I mean, it seems reasonable to me, some good screen limits. Like I think he has an hour a day of gaming or something like that. But they said they're having problems with when it's time to turn it off, he has a meltdown. Even if he's agreed ahead of time, an hour, and they give him the warning so that he can finish his level or whatever it is, it just seems like it's never enough. And he gets really, really upset and, yells and screams when it's time to turn it off. And then after he does turn it off, he's miserable for the entire night. Like, you never let me play enough screens. All I want to do is play screens, and this is so unfair. And what would you say to help this family?
Sure, it's a great point. So I think sometimes what a lot of parents don't realize is what kind of behavior they're reinforcing. So especially if we're talking about a 10-year-old, so 10-year-olds aren't really great at keeping their word. Their brains are not so well developed to where they agree to something, and then when it comes around to it, they just don't have that capacity.
Yeah, and it's like his mom says he's almost just like, yeah, I know. Like, he just wants to get to the screen so bad he'll agree to anything. Right. So even if he could keep his word, he's just really just wants to get to that screen.
Right. So that there's so much fascinating stuff there. The first is that the child is not actually participating in the conversation. Right? He's just saying, yeah, it's not actually listening. The second thing is that I don't hear that there's any consequence to him throwing temper tantrums and being miserable.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I would sort of recommend in that situation is they agreed to 1 hour a day. And this is a very common mistake that I think a lot of parents make. How did you decide on 1 hour a day? What's the basis of that? So if 1 hour a day is just making the rest of the day miserable, you should do less than 1 hour a day, or even 0 hours a day. And that's the kind of thing where what I find that parents really need to understand is that if the hour remains the same, irrespective of the child's behavior, then the child's behavior isn't going to change.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I would advise those parents, and we have a parent coaching program too, is that to really talk to the child about, okay, so the hour a day depends on your ability to engage and enjoy in the rest of the day.
Mm-hmm.
What's our goal here? Our goal here is for you to have fun. If 1 hour a day means that you don't have fun for the rest of the day, you're not actually having fun every day. Just like you're saying, you're complaining. And that's where really helping the child understand that if it ruins the rest of your day, we're not going to do it. Now they're going to throw a temper tantrum because we said 1 hour a day. And that's where the parent also needs to say, yeah, so we're going to change the way that we think about screen time. What's the goal? What are you supposed to be doing every day? You're supposed to be having fun. You're supposed to be doing this. And what I'm hearing is that screen time, even if you play 5 minutes, if you don't get to play 15 hours, then you're not happy. The other thing that I encourage parents to do is let them play for 8 hours and let's see how your day goes. I'll encourage parents to check in with their kids every 15 minutes, 30 minutes, hour. And I do this with my own kids. I have a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old. And then I'll ask my 8-year-old, like, hey, so you've been able to watch for an hour? Like, how much fun did you have? Are you having lots of fun? Do you want to continue doing it? Are you still having the same amount of fun? And as I'm sure most parents know, the kid isn't glued there having a blast for 4 hours. They get increasingly wiggly, right? They're getting bored. They're not even enjoying themselves. And then you can sort of invite them to notice that you're not even having fun, but you don't want to stop. How do you understand that?
So that's fascinating to me. In your experience, are kids good at being able to tell? Because from what I hear from my clients, their kids would be thrilled if they could play 6 or 8 or 12 hours a day.
So kids are good at what they're taught.
Okay.
Right. So I studied for 7 years to become a monk, and I started meditating with my kids like at the age of 2 or 3. And so I invite them to notice a lot. So I think the more that we teach these kinds of skills to parents about just notice, right, as a kid, invite your kid to notice. And kids are like pretty perceptive. And that's where you can also train the skill of noticing outside of stuff related to technology. So that's where I think parents run into a lot of trouble, is if we sort of think about training your child's skills and then what environment can you focus on the skills without kind of the addiction. That's really important. So really just inviting your kid to notice, okay, let's try this and let's see what we learn. The first hour, how much fun are you having? The second hour, how much fun are you having? The third hour, how much fun are you having? And you'd be surprised, because then the parent is also giving the kid 3 hours instead of 1.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it actually works pretty well if you kind of work at it for a while.
So I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around what this would look like, because you've said things that seem a little bit contradictory in terms of if the kid is miserable after his hour, then the point is to have fun. Maybe you wouldn't have any screen time, but then you also said, or maybe you let him have 3 hours and keep checking in with them. So can you just elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah. So I get how that's confusing. So the general approach is for you and the child to learn together. No, we're not making any permanent plan.
Okay.
There's a diagnosis phase and there's a treatment phase, and those are two completely different things.
Okay.
So in the diagnosis phase, we need to understand what the impact of screen time is on your child's mind, their emotions, their enjoyment of the day.
Okay.
And how can we figure out what the impact is? One experiment that we can run, right? We can do like something like a lab test, which is, okay, let's actually have you play for 4 hours a day. Let's see what that does. Because maybe your child can actually handle it, right? Who knows? Maybe 4 hours a day will result in less of their, temper tantrums and stuff like that. Maybe they'll be content with it. And then on the flip side, maybe we can reduce down to 0 and we can see what that does. So let's try to figure out as parent and child together what works for you or what doesn't work for you. That's one thing. The second thing is on behavioral reinforcement. So if we're taking an isolated case of 1 hour a day doesn't seem to be working, right? The kid gets some amount of enjoyment, but then they're miserable the rest of the day. This is where you can do some amount of behavioral reinforcement there where, the criteria for you to watch 1 hour a day is not just that's what we said. The criteria is you need to be able to enjoy the rest of your day. You need to be able to stop at 1 hour. Mm-hmm. And unless you can do those two things, you can't watch 1 hour, right? So the reward depends on the child's ability to engage with the technology in a healthy way.
Okay.
So what we teach at HG is restraint instead of restriction. So we really encourage, and this is what we kind of do with parents, is we'll help them understand all these things and how to have conversations. Because one of the things I've learned as an addiction psychiatrist is a parent cannot be sober for their child. If you're really conquering addiction, the kid has to want to set limits as well.
Right.
So our whole ethos about becoming a healthy gamer is about helping the parent and child really understand, okay, what are the goals? What do you enjoy? And how can we sort of align our plan to meet those things?
Okay, I get that. And so one thing before we were talking about balance, and one thing that I always talk to parents about when they want to, their kids to cut back on screen time or games is that they have to have other things to do. Like, what do you say when, kids are saying, well, okay, maybe I won't do so much screen time, but I don't have anything else to do. Do you have any suggestions about that?
Yeah, so I know this sounds kind of weird, but I think suggestions that are not aligned with goals are just like, I just want you to stop doing screen time. Well, why? Well, because it's bad for you. In what way? Mm-hmm. I don't know. It's just bad for you. You're miserable all the time. Okay, well, so I think the right place to start is let's take a big step back. Let's understand, okay, what is the child's responsibility? What is the parent's responsibility? What are we trying to do here? And what we found with our parents and their gaming children is that aligning towards the child's values and the parent's values is what should determine the activities. So, for example, when we work with slightly older kids, like 16-year-olds, why do they play games so much? Well, they're in high school, they're awkward, they're going through puberty, they've got, they don't feel good in their own skin, they've got acne. So what can we do to replace gaming? It's not about replacing gaming, it's talking to the child about, okay, what do you want? Well, I don't like the way that I look. Okay, I'm not confident in myself. So let's try to figure out activities that meet your goals.
So you're saying that the reason why they might be playing so many games is because they feel awkward, socially awkward, and this fills the time and gives them some purpose. So you're looking at and I have to say, I heard you say this on another video, that you're looking at the need that the video game fills and trying to find the need to fill the need in another way.
Absolutely, right? So this is a kid who feels socially anxious, and so the game numbs them out. But every day that they play, it's not like their social skills improve. They fall further and further behind. And 16-year-olds understand that, right? So then it's the child having a conversation with the parent having a conversation with the child of, okay, if this is the problem, or if you're unhappy with this, would you rather be socially competent? Would you rather feel confident in yourself? Would you rather be happier about your body? And the kid is going to say yes. Mm-hmm. And then the parent's got an angle, right? So, okay, let's figure out, like, what about martial arts class 1 hour a week? Or swimming, or what would you like to do that you think would build confidence? And then you really have to enroll the child in meeting those goals. And that's really what we try to do, is build an alliance between the parent and the child, which is really what you have to do, because you can't do it for them. Mm-hmm. Now, for younger kids, this is a little bit different, but because they don't really quite have the insight into, what they want or what they need. They just want to have fun. But this is also where my kids never want to go to gymnastics class. They'd rather be at home. But I'll ask them, I make a point of reflecting with them afterward. Hey, how was gymnastics today? Did you have fun? Would you have rather stayed home? What did you learn? How do you feel about yourself now?
Mm-hmm.
right? So really helping the children really understand, like through reflection, like, okay, when I don't play games, I actually feel okay.
And so you just to highlight what you said with younger kids, it's often about fun. So for a parent who wants a child to want to reduce their own screen time, it would be helping them find some more ways of having fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So and that's where you can talk to your kids. You can say, hey, so you can sort of lay a firm boundary. So start with, it's not okay for you to play as much as you play. So we're going to try to figure out how you can have fun outside of gaming. What do you think would work? And if they can't think of anything, that's okay. You can give them a menu of options. Do you want to try soccer? Do you want to try swimming? Do you want to try chess club? Do you want to do this? And that's where I also think that like building in rewards is pretty good. So what I'll have parents, what parents will end up doing is we're actually not going to game at all during the week. But on Friday night, your friends can come over. We're going to grab 4 controllers and y'all can play Mario Kart until midnight. I'm going to order y'all pizza at 10 o'clock. Y'all can stay up till 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m. You can sleep in on Saturday. And then, so sometimes kids are like flexible because they don't necessarily need an hour a day. It's really even asking kids, what is it that you enjoy about the game? What's the
Mm-hmm.
funnest part? And how can we actually support the funnest part without sort of creating consequences in our lives? Because as a gamer myself, playing 1 hour a day sounds absolutely awful.
Right?
Like I would rather play, and this is the way that I game. So I'd rather play for 4 hours with a group of friends when you're kind of like, doing something, it's a lot of fun. And then I'm happy skipping it 5 days a week if I can sort of compile it.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of times parents don't think about, okay, you don't have to restrict to one hour a week. Talk to your kid about what's the most enjoyable parts.
Right. So maybe, and I know that's something you picked up on, right? When I told you about that case study was, well, why the 1 hour a day? Who decided that? The parents. And so maybe the first step is actually just having that conversation with your kid about, with balance in mind, would you rather have a little bit every day or would you rather have a lot on Saturdays or whatever, and just having that conversation?
Absolutely. So I think, the 3 things that parents, I think, need to do is, first of all, understand what video games do to our mind, our brain. Second thing they need to do is talk to their kid and really build an alliance and really try to get on the same team about, okay, what are the goals of being a kid? Having fun is an important goal of being a kid. But when you play a game for 1 hour and it makes you miserable the rest of the day, that's not a good trade from a fun standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you want to spend 8 hours a day gaming, like, fine. So instead of doing 1 hour a day, give them 8 hours on Saturday. Would you rather do that? And then the last thing that we sort of really focus on is boundary setting and really paying attention to behavioral reinforcement. Because this is a situation where the child is miserable and there's no consequence. And so every day is a war, right? Because every day you're just fighting the same uphill battle because there's no negative consequence to the child being unable to engage in fun.
Well, I mean, I guess the natural consequence is that he's miserable, which we
Absolutely.
don't necessarily want.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So from the child's perspective, there's no behavioral consequence for them being miserable and whining all the time. Right.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. I often say to parents, like, if we can't tell the kids, if we can't turn it off without a giant meltdown, we just might not be able to turn it on.
100%.
Not to make anyone, not doing it to make them feel bad, but just like, this isn't part of the deal.
Absolutely. And I think, and that too, as a parent, you want to say that and say, hey, like, what's the purpose of a game? It's to have fun.
Mm-hmm.
And if you play for 1 hour and it ruins the rest of your day, that's not actually achieving our goal.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. So say you have a situation where you have our arbitrary 1 hour limit, but just for argument's sake, I'm going to stick with that. It doesn't make the kid miserable, like meltdown when they turn it off after an hour, but they're like, I'm bored. There's nothing to do. Why can't I, just play more screen or whatever? Is there a place for just saying it's okay if you're bored?
Absolutely. So I think our society as a whole is becoming increasingly intolerant of boredom. So if you like, the number of people that I know that can't go to the bathroom without their phone is like skyrocketing. And we can't even, like, pardon my language, we can't even take a dump without our phone now. And it's crazy. Like, what are you doing there?
I can go with a magazine.
Fair enough. You're probably in the exception. I think, if you look at people who are 20, 30, like, it's really hard for them to go without their phone. So I think that we sometimes lose sight of the value of boredom. And this is something that we have in the HG community, which we have over 100,000 people in this community. And we have a really interesting practice that it's kind of like a crucible that we put people through. They choose to do it, which is stare at a wall for an hour. It's almost like a meditation practice. And it's amazing. We've gotten over 10,000 people to just stare at a wall over an hour.
That's awesome.
And in our community, they'll record themselves staring at a wall and they'll speed it up to like an 8-minute video. And all kinds of stuff happens. First, you get bored. Then, like, even by the end of the hour, some people are like crying and stuff because all these like suppressed emotions come up. So we'll really encourage people to let their mind wander. So pace, go for walks. And I think learning to be bored and self-entertainment is correlated with creativity, actually. Mm-hmm. So the more that a child gets bored, the more creative they become.
Okay, good, because that's what I tell parents.
Yeah.
My middle son, who's 19, just told me that he's started to challenge himself to ride the subway and walk places without listening to anything on his phone, just because he realized he's just like, Mom, I just don't have any time where I've just got like nothing, in my head. I thought that was amazing that he thought of that.
Yeah, I think that's what happens, right? So I used to be at a point in my life where it would be like constant. Like I would wake up, I was in med school. And so I'd wake up and I'd start listening to audio even while I was cooking or cleaning or eating. And then maybe I'm watching something while I'm eating a meal. And then I'm like, headphones in. And this was all for the sake of productivity, where, I thought like, okay, if I'm constantly listening to lectures, like I'll be a better medical student. But what I really found is that giving my brain time to process the information was a lot more important than just like constantly dumping it into my head.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's shift just a little bit onto preventive measures. So, say you've got kids who aren't full on like super into games, but you think that that's in your future. Are there ways that families can healthily introduce gaming or maybe like just some healthy guidelines if you don't have somebody who's got like a problem with games?
Sure, absolutely. So I think there are a couple of things to understand. The first is that gaming consoles or PCs in family areas are like a great place to start. So if a kid has access to a PC or console in their room, it increases their gaming time by 50%. The second thing is that gaming is something that can be done as a family. And so if you look at games, there are different kinds of games. And the thing when I was growing up, like games ended. Like you beat a game and then it's done. Now games are never ending. Like, so you can literally play 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and you'll never beat the game. It will literally never end. There's always something else to do. And so game designers have done this on purpose, right? Because as long as there's something to do, you're playing their game, which is perfect. And now these are multi-billion-dollar corporations that will have thousands of developers, graphic designers, artists, things like that, constantly making content for the game. So I think console multiplayer games are like really healthy. So things like Mario Kart or Mario Party, where you're kind of doing it as a family activity. The gaming is not the gaming is something you do as a family, as opposed to it's just gaming. I also think that sort of binge patterns in some ways can be better. So like, okay, tonight what we're going to do is we're going to all play together. So like we're going to order a pizza and we're going to like turn on the console and we'll play for like 4 hours. And when we're done, we're done. So I think those kinds of things are really good. So I tend to play larger amounts of time with my kids rather than on a daily basis. And so I'll actually let them play for like 2 or 3 hours. And it's like, okay, when we're satisfied, that's when we can stop. And I'll check in with them an hour, 2, hour, 3. What do y'all want to do? Let's take a break. No, let's keep playing. And what I sort of find is that it's easier to convince them the further in you get. And then, okay, so like after 2 or 3 hours, like let's take a break. Let's go do something else. And then what do y'all want to do the rest of the day? Should we go get ice cream? So you can kind of weave it into the rest of your life, which is the right way to do it. I think there are also the kinds of games you play are really, really important. I think some of these very simple, like dopaminergic games that are kind of like Jelly Splash or Candy Crush, where there's no strategy to it, there's no story to it, there's no narrative to it. It's just kind of like mindless sort of stuff. I strongly discourage, because it doesn't do anything except trigger that dopamine release. You're not even learning anything. So I think, start doing it as a family. Don't have restricted access or have it in common spaces. And I think be super careful about gaming as it's not without it being integrated into the rest of your family. That's what I would kind of recommend.
Yeah, I love that. When my boys were little, they're 19 and 22, and I have a daughter too, but we got a Wii when they were, I think, 4 and 7, and we used to just play Wii. Probably most people don't even know what Wii is. Wii even around anymore?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, people know the Switch, but I
Okay.
think people know what a Wii is.
Yeah, no, we played Wii games like the Mario Kart and all of that stuff. And my husband really wanted to get a PlayStation when they were older, and we did not, because we thought that that would help them not develop a gaming habit. And that really worked well for our family. Like, they played at friends' houses, but by the time they were mid-teenagers, they'd go over to their friends' houses, they'd come home and say, all they wanted to do was play, X or whatever the game was. And it was boring to them because they didn't grow up with a lot of that. So I thought that worked really well. But the family thing is definitely what we did too, like the boxing and all of that stuff.
So I think when you do that, what the child learns is, so we can have fun as a family. We can go on a hike. We can play games. We can go to a movie. We can go out for ice cream. The fun part is with the family. It's not one activity that's the fun part, right?
Mm-hmm.
All of those things are fun. And so kids will naturally learn that these things can substitute for each other. What we really see as a problem is when kids, they think about gaming as a completely separate thing that they really, really enjoy, and it really beats out everything else, which is not how I recommend it.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing also is just that the importance of connection in the family is one measure that can help kids not go down the road of becoming addicted to gaming, and that even doing games together as a family is a way of building that connection.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. There was one more thing I was going to ask. Oh, I was going to ask you about specific games. One, I don't know if it's waned a little bit in popularity, but there's one game that I've heard of particularly that a lot of like 8, 9, 10-year-old boys like to play, which is Fortnite. Are there games that I keep hearing about that game. It seems particularly hard for kids to turn off. Are there any games that you would say that are better than others? Like, I've heard that Minecraft is like a great game for kids to play because it's creative, and it actually it can be a good game, like helpful game. Do you have any recommendations specifically of games to avoid, or games that are good to get?
Yeah, so I think there's a problem with that question, which is it assumes that all people are the same.
Okay.
So what we know there are lots of studies on personality and neuroscience that show that different kinds of people get addicted to and enjoy different kinds of games. So, so for example, like when we'll talk about Fortnite in a second, because they do something that's really interesting from a neuroscience perspective. So there's studies that show that, for example, MMORPGs like World of Warcraft is one of the most famous ones. It is the game that leads to the most meltdowns in children on the autism spectrum. So MMORPGs correlate with meltdowns in kids who are on the spectrum.
Massive multiplayer online playing
RPG, yeah.
games? Okay.
And if you look at female gamers, for example, they're the most likely, or their favorite genre is the MMORPG, because when women, on average, right? So every woman's different, but what you'll sort of find is that women play games for different reasons than men. So women play games for a sense of community and stuff like that. And that can be really fantastic in WoW too. So it's not like the game is good or bad. There's an individual child component. There's a personality component. If we look at Fortnite, one of the reasons that it was so addictive is because they had one feature in the game which they really discovered, which is that you start in an arena with like 100 people. And then as people get eliminated from the arena, the world starts to shrink. And so what it does is it forces the people to kind of engage with each other. But I think they really figured out something really interesting from a reinforcement angle, which is that Fortnite is a game that you can never relax in, because you never know when someone is around the corner. And yet it has lulls. So it's not a game of constant action, which would develop some amount of tolerance. But so it has these lulls, but you can never like mentally check out. So you're constantly on the edge of your seat. And then there's like some kind of conflict. And then you fight someone for 30 to 60 seconds. And then there's like 2 to 3 minutes of lag time on average. But it could be 5 seconds of lag time. It could be 15. It could be 4. So the game, you never know what to expect, which is part of the reason why I think they made it was so addictive. And I think what Fortnite sort of did is I think they were very calculating in I don't know if this kind of makes sense, but the rate of shrinkage of the arena. So what they did is they found the perfect time window that keeps you constantly on the edge of your seat, but not in constant action. So there are bursts of activity that are really, really engaging. And something about that formula is, I think, really what made it so addictive.
Mm-hmm.
I do think it's starting to wane a little bit. And I think if you look at things like Minecraft, yeah, Minecraft is cool because you're kind of building things and there is some amount of creativity to it. But I've absolutely worked with people who are addicted to Minecraft as
Okay.
well. And
Yeah.
they get lost building this virtual world instead of building anything in the real world.
Right. So, yeah. Okay. I appreciate that you corrected the question because you can probably tell I'm not a gamer. I've asked a lot of
No,
silly questions.
no, I don't think they're silly questions at all. I think that this is just how parents approach gaming, right? It's 1 hour a day, which games are best, which games are not best.
Mhm.
And it's sort of like, okay, like if we think about food or friends, how many friends should we have? Should we have one friend? Should we have three friends? Which friends are best?
Right. Right.
Well, that depends.
Yeah.
And so gaming is kind of the same way. And one of the things we really encourage parents to do is start to really talk to their kids about why do you play it? What do you enjoy about it? Because then you'll figure out what works for your child.
I love that so much. And I just want to reinforce that idea of, if you think your kid is playing too many games, look at what the need is that it's meeting. Are they lonely? Do they not have enough activities? Are they worried about, that they're not good enough at soccer? So they would like to play soccer, but they don't because they don't feel good enough. So I just love that so much. I think that's really helpful. I don't know if a lot of parents see video games as meeting a need.
Yeah. And that's why they're so good, because over time, developers have figured out how to fulfill more and more needs, because they used to be multiplayer. I mean, they used to be single player, and now they're multiplayer. So now there's a community aspect. Yeah.
I was just going to say, in terms of like the multiplayer aspect, is there, and I know you're probably going to say like talk to your kid and figure out what's best. But one thing I hear a lot is parents saying, well, I feel bad saying, to turn the game off because that's the only way they talk to their friends. Do you hear that a lot?
Absolutely. That's a huge problem, right? So, and that's where if you sort of think about it, this is part of the reason that parents get kind of confused when you turn off the game or you take away the console, because I don't think a lot of parents realize you're not just taking away the game. So the other problem is when we use the word game, we think about games as recreational. Now games are the formation of our and maintenance of our social relationships. So if you kind of think about, okay, if you ground your child and you take away the game for the week, imagine in your case if someone stuck you in jail for a week and you could not see anyone, any of your friends or any of your family or stuff like that. That's the punishment that you're actually instituting for your child. It's not just the removal of recreation, it's the isolation from your friend group, which is part of the reason why the resistance is so high and the parents are confused. And they think, oh my God, my kid is so addicted because they're resisting so hard, whereas they don't really understand what the impact of the game is.
Am I just old fashioned, or does it seem a little scary that kids have most of their friends online, or is that not even true? Like, what about in-person friends?
Yeah, so that's where our approach at Healthy Gamer is. What we believe is that you can have real, authentic relationships online, and that you should not become exclusively dependent on your online relationships. So, for example, I started playing this game called StarCraft with someone when I was 12 or 13. And the interesting thing is that when I graduated from high school and I went to college, all of my friends from high school went in 1,000 different directions. And I took my online friends with me. And then I finished college and I went to med school. Everyone got fractured. I took my online friends with me. I played games with this guy for 14 years. And then I met him for the first time at my bachelor party, because we were real friends. I mean, he was there before I started dating my girlfriend, fiance, and then wife. And so we kind of grew together, and it's a very authentic friendship. But I think the tricky thing is that when we become dependent on online relationships, it atrophies our social skills, and then we get stuck in the online world. And the problem is that you can have an authentic friend online, but if I'm having a bad day, that friend can never give me a hug.
Yeah.
Right? There are some things that online relationships cannot fulfill.
Yeah. And I totally believe that. I have friends I've never met in person either that I've met through, my parent coaching, like other parent coaches. But do you have any tips for parents on how to help their kids find balance? Because that's what it sounds like you're saying again, is like, yeah, they have friends online and they should also have real life friends. Any way to help promote that balance or help kids understand? I guess that's part of the problem, is help them understand that there should be a balance.
Yeah, so I think everyone's focused on balance, which makes sense. But I think that starts with help your child get at least one enjoyable relationship in the real world. Now, how does that happen? So, I think any kind of activity that you can kind of get your kid to agree to do, and then sort of talking to them before the activity and sort of saying, hey, one of the reasons that I'm encouraging you to do this is because I think it's important for you to make friends. Also acknowledging how hard it is. Talking to your kid. So I think this is where a lot of what we recommend is not actually telling a kid what the solution is, but listen to your kid. What makes it hard for you to make friends? As we're going here, are you concerned about what people are going to think about you? And really just listen to them. And then over time, it's going to be hard, but we're going to keep doing that. And also letting the kid know that there's flexibility here. So one thing that I would recommend is, let's say you're signing up your kid for martial arts class and say, we're going to try this for 4 weeks. Okay. Here's the reasons that we're doing it, because you want to get physically fit. You want to feel better about yourself, and hopefully you can make some friends. At the end of 4 weeks, if it's not working for you, we can stop. We can try to fix something else. It's about what are the goals we're trying to achieve as opposed to doing a particular activity.
Mm-hmm.
And then also kind of gentle encouragement, right? So you can ask your kids if they want to invite their friends to something. I sort of play quarterback for my kids. So when I'm, when my kids go to gymnastics, I'll very actively introduce myself to their parents. And then I'll say, hey, like, what do y'all think about grabbing dinner like next week? Do y'all want to do that as a family? It seems like our kids get along. And really sort of creating that structure, especially for younger kids, to form those relationships.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Well, thank you so much. This has been a really interesting and helpful conversation. To confess, it's made me feel a little bit old, but I didn't grow up with video games. I mean, maybe, Atari. That was, when I think back to what the video games we played at sleepovers was like Pong, if you remember.
Yeah.
And think how far video games have come. It's pretty wild. So 2 questions for you before I let you go. One is, where can folks find out more about you and what you do, the best place to look you up online?
Sure. So we've got a YouTube channel called Healthy Gamer GG. We actually just launched a parent YouTube channel, and so they can check that out as well. And then you can just find us at www.healthygamer.gg. We also have a Healthy Gamer Facebook group that is actually for parents. So these are people who have gone through our parent coaching program or our course. And that's where you can find us.
All right. Final question is the one I ask all my guests, which is, if you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself? Can be not video game related, about anything.
Give myself?
Yeah. To get in
I
your
wouldn't
time
give
machine.
myself any advice.
You wouldn't give yourself any advice?
Nope. No. I mean, so this is the weird thing, right? But I think I am who I am because of the mistakes that I made. And we sort of think about advice. Why do we give advice? It's to prevent ourselves, presumably, from making mistakes. But if let's say I gave myself advice to where I never failed out of college, I got a 4.0 GPA, right? People think that that's better than failing out of college. But if I had never struggled with gaming addiction, if I had never failed out of college, I would not be able to help kids the way that I am today. And so it's really bizarre. But like, I know it's really bizarre, but this also has something to do with my spiritual beliefs and stuff like that, where like things happen for a reason. And my failures, like, sure, they hurt in the time, but that's also when I learned about what the value of relationships are, right? I used to go to bed every night and I had to game to the point of absolute exhaustion because, if I didn't, all these negative thoughts would rush into my head. But now I know what it's like to struggle. So the basic advice that I wouldn't give myself any advice. I think I'm flying blind, and that's good.
Well, you're the first person that I've asked that question who gave that answer. So that's really interesting and cool. All right. Well, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. I hope you found this conversation insightful and exactly what you needed in this moment. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Remember that I'm rooting for you. I see you out there showing up for your kids and doing the best you can. Sending hugs over the airwaves today. Hang in there. You've got this.